August 216. Dawn sees the Romans taking up positions to offer battle, and Hannibal rides out to a ridge, looks at it, gives the signal to his general staff who are around him, says, yeah, let's go for this. The Battle of Cannae is about to begin. So the Roman infantry is lined up in 4 distinct ranks. The first line consists of very lightly armed skirmishers who are called velites, and these are the youngest and the poorest. Very groovily, they would often wear wolf skins.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You have your little spears and you have your wolf skin, and you form a screen in front of the main block of the heavy infantry, and they form 3 lines. So the first line is a group called hastati. These are men in their late teens, early 20s. So they're young, they're full of vigor, but they're not as experienced as the next line of heavy infantry, who are called the principes, so the chief men. These are guys who are in the prime of life. They're very fit, they're very strong, but they're also experienced. And then at the back, you have a line called the triarii, who are the veterans. The aim of it is to enable fresh units constantly to be filtered up to the front, so that if one line gets kind of annihilated or loses energy or whatever, then they can easily be replaced. The Roman plan basically is just to kind of advance and steamroller the enemy. Hannibal's dispositions are much more complicated. As usual, like the Romans have done, he stations his infantry in the center and his cavalry on the wings. He has Mahabal, who's in command of the Numidian light cavalry, on the right wing, so he is facing the allied cavalry commanded by Varro. On the left wing, so facing Paulus and the Roman cavalry, he's put the Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry under the command of another very seasoned officer called, inevitably, Hasdrubal. And Hasdrubal is in command of about 7,000 men, so he is outnumbering the Roman cavalry under Paulus about 3-1. That is where the Carthaginians have the advantage. But obviously, when it comes to infantry, that is a very different story, because the Carthaginians there are massively outnumbered. However, fortunately for Hannibal, he has a plan. It's a very cunning plan. So what he does is he draws up his Spanish and Gallic heavy infantry in a continuous line facing the Romans, so stretching for almost a mile and a half. And compared to the Romans, this Carthaginian battle line is very, very slender. Hannibal stations himself and Mago, his younger brother, in the center of the line, and he then leads the center of the line outwards towards the Roman lines. So the effect is to create a kind of crescent. The line starts to bulge outwards towards the Roman center. Hannibal's aim in doing this is to ensure that the Roman effort will be kind of focused on the middle of the plain. And the reason that he does this is because he knows that this is how the legions fight, that their aim is always to push through the middle of their enemy's battle line. If they do that, then they will inevitably break through the Carthaginian line because it's so thin relative to the Romans. And Hannibal has planned for this eventuality. So he is assuming that in the long run, the Roman line will break through the Spaniards and the Gauls. And he has kept back the Libyans, who are like a kind of phalanx, great long spears, and equipped with Roman arms and Roman armor. These are Hannibal's best, most disciplined troops. And he has stationed them behind the front line and at an angle to it, so that if you imagine the Romans break through the line of the Spaniards and Gauls, the Libyans are like a pair of pincers ready to close in. So the Romans will think that they've broken through, they go rushing forwards, the Libyans will close in and capture them on their flanks. I mean, that is a difficult maneuver to pull off, but obviously if it does work, then potentially it's going to be very, very devastating in its effect. So the battle lines are drawn up, and the people who begin are the skirmishers. The Carthaginians, again, are outnumbered, but they are much, much more proficient than the velites, the Roman skirmishers in their wolf clothes and stuff. And in particular, the Balearic slingers, my favourite, are absolutely lethal. So they have a much longer range than the velites do with their little spears. They're very accurate. The slingshot is coming out, you've got all this dust blowing up, very difficult to see the slingshot as it comes. If it hits you on the helmet, it's possible to kind of knock you out, And so understandably, the Roman infantry decide, well, we don't want this. Get rid of the velites. The velites withdraw. This is daily Syria. I think he's right. They go right the way back behind the full line of the Roman heavy infantry. And this then means that the front line of the Roman heavy infantry are in a position to advance. Meanwhile, you've got the cavalry. And on the banks of the Ophidius, the river, which is where Hasdrubal's Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry are facing Paulus's Roman horse, it is all kicking off. And the Carthaginians, even as the skirmishers are still doing their stuff with their javelins and their slingshot and stuff, the Carthaginian cavalry are herring towards the Romans. They just pile into Paulus and his men. They are absolutely swept away. They have not managed to put up a fight at all. Paulus is able to clamber his way into the main body of the infantry, so he, is able to survive this rout. But I mean, it's very poor on the part of the Roman horse, and brilliant for Hasdrubal and his men, who have swept the Roman flank clear. And Hasdrubal does not do a Prince Rupert, so he doesn't go herring off after the Roman cavalry. He wheels round, and he looks at the state of battle, and what he decides to do we will come to in due course, because meanwhile in the main field of battle, where the two great blocks of infantry are facing one another, clash point is happening. So the Roman young men, but probably the best, the most seasoned, the most proficient in fighting, have been stationed in the front rank. They are smashing their weapons on their wooden shields, kind of terrifying counterpart to this great nodding crests that they have on their helmets. Their armor is brilliantly polished. And on the other side, you have the Spaniards and the Gauls. They are holding their position. Remember the front of the bulge, very, very close to the Roman line. They're raising their own war cries. The Gallic war cries in particular are notorious. They also have their, these trumpets, the carnix, terrifying din. And so it's not surprising that the moment that the skirmishers are out of the way, the Romans charge. They're thinking, let's get this over and done with. So the Hastati, they advance. The front ranks, probably the front 2 or 3, because they don't want to start hitting their own men with javelins. They hurl them. The effect of this is less effective than normal, because effectively they, because of the bulge of the Carthaginian line, they can't actually reach most of the Carthaginian front line with their spears. And then they charge, and the hope is that they will be able to break the enemy so that they just go running away, and then the killing can start. But this doesn't happen. The Spaniards and Gauls hold their positions, partly because they're very seasoned veterans by this point, partly because Hannibal and Mago is there with them in the front rank, and partly because they just hate the Romans, and probably they trust in Hannibal that his strategy is going to work and that they're going to have their vengeance. It's a very kind of grinding clash. It's kind of man on man, and effectively the whole line is this kind of series of duels between Gauls and Spaniards against Romans, and just physically relentless and demanding. The lines are kind of engaging, then withdrawing, engaging, then withdrawing. But the advantage of the Roman manipular system is that people, men who just become too tired or too wounded, can be withdrawn, and they can funnel more people forward. So there is this kind of relentless sense of fresh men coming to the front line. And so it's unsurprising that as the fighting goes on, although the Gauls and Spaniards fight with the utmost ferocity and implacability, the Roman weight of numbers does start to tell. And as the Roman front line grinds forward, the crescent that the Gauls and the Spaniards have formed starts to flatten and then to buckle and to be pushed backwards. And the Romans in the center give a great cheer. They can scent victory. They push forwards. Space opens up behind them as they do so. More troops come filling in to fill the gap. The order of the maniples starts to be lost. It's a great excited crush because everyone wants to share in the victory. Cries of joy, of triumph, kind of rippling through the entire Roman battle line. The feeling is absolutely that the battle is won, but of course Hannibal still has his 2 deadly cards to play. And as the Gauls and Spaniards retreat, space has opened up for the Libyans, who have hitherto been held in reserve, to crash into the flanks of the advancing Romans. And it happens exactly as Hannibal has planned. I mean, it couldn't go better, because by now the Romans are so tightly packed that they haven't got any opportunity to maneuver, and in fact it's quite difficult for them even to kind of raise their sword arms.
And you said he had 2 cards to play. He's played one, which was the Libyans. Now, the second, of course, you mentioned it before, Hasdrubal and the heavy cavalry. As you said, they haven't gone shooting off.
No.
They now return to the fray, don't they?
So what Hasdrubal does is he then turns around the length of the Roman infantry to go to the other wing where the Numidians under Hannibal have been having a standoff with the Italians under Varro, because the Numidians are light, they don't want to engage with the Italian cavalry. But now suddenly Hasdrubal and his heavy cavalry come sweeping up. The Italians are swept away again. Varro is swept away with them, so he's gone from the scene of the battle. He survives, but he's now gone. This means that Hasdrubal and his heavy cavalry can now crash into the rear of the Roman infantry. And the likelihood is the infantry in the rear of the Roman battle line are not the seasoned veterans with their long spears who could have formed a phalanx and kept the cavalry away, but the velites, the skirmishers with their wolfskins. And there is nothing that they can do against heavy cavalry. And then they start crashing forwards, and the press of Romans trying to withdraw pushes back in, and the whole Roman army now is surrounded. You've got the Gauls and the Spaniards on the front, you've got the Libyans on the flanks, you've got Hasdrubal's cavalry in the rear. The process of annihilation is now set in train, and it takes Hannibal's men many hours. And it must have been a hideous experience for everyone. I mean, completely exhausting, even for Hannibal's men. You know, their shields are heavy, their sword arms are starting to ache, they're drenched in sweat, lots of them are wounded. And I imagine that as the battle goes on, so the kind of the pauses between the bouts of combat go longer and longer. And I think it's hard to overemphasize the horror of their fate, the physical crush, the panic, and the certainty of approaching death. Because if you're in the center of this kind of great crush of men, imagine, you know, you don't really know what's happening, and then the news comes to you about what's happened. You're stuck there waiting for the Carthaginian swords and spears to reach you. I mean, just hideous. People start to void their bowels, to urinate with terror, to vomit. Piles of corpses are starting to rise. The sun is high in the sky, so they're starting to smell. It's drifting across the battlefield. Death from the air, slingshot is starting to rain down again. You've still got this blinding dust and blood just everywhere, drenching it. I mean, it's like wading through a sea of viscera. And by the end of the day, upwards of, tens of thousands of Romans are dead.
Yeah, just looking at the estimates, between 50 and 70,000 men probably were killed. I mean, just absolutely massacred where they stood. And, for Hannibal, this must be a victory beyond his wildest dreams.
It's the most astonishing, the most remarkable victory that any general had ever won in history. And that is why it continues to be studied and admired by military strategists to this day. And you can't say that of any other ancient battle. It has a kind of perfection, a terrifying perfection about it.